Thanks for joining us today for the Conform to Christ podcast, where we seek to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ. I'm Jay Jones. I'm here with George Mays for Text Driven Tuesday. Morning.
Good morning.
How's it going?
It's all right.
Yeah.
It's a Monday morning.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be in Genesis today, finishing up this section. Genesis chapter 3, focusing in on verses 20 through 24. So grab your Bible and go there. And you asked a good question to start it out. Well, that was a good question.
Yeah.
People probably have wondered
Oh, yeah.
if they've thought about stuff they read, which hopefully they do.
Yeah.
And the question is, were Adam and Eve saved? And it's a relevant question. You think like all of the world is awful.
Yeah.
And they did it. It was their responsibility.
Right.
It all kind of falls on them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Trace all of human misery back to these two.
yeah.
And so it's a logical question. I think
Yeah.
it's just a natural question that people can ask about the text. Like, all right, what happened to them? Like, did Adam and Eve go to hell?
Yeah.
Or were they saved?
And
And
their people are divided on that.
There's debate.
Yeah. And you're gonna kind of answer that question as we move through
I'll try to.
this passage.
Yeah. And someone as prominent as A.W. Pink believes that Adam perished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which A.W. Pink was a weird guy, so take what he says with a grain of salt sometimes.
What kind of happened to him?
He got
disgruntled.
He got really disillusioned by the local church.
Yeah.
Because he's a Calvinist, and he kept getting
Turned on,
run off from. He just kept getting run off from the churches he was at, and so he eventually just kind of became a hermit.
Yeah, it's kind of a sad story.
Kind of broke away from any local church, and he started a magazine, and so most of his books are collections of articles that he wrote for this magazine.
Oh.
And so he just published this magazine, and that was about it.
Huh.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of a warning for us Calvinists. Like, don't get discouraged. But also, I think it's a warning to just even non-Calvinists. Like, unless you're saying Calvinists are literally not Christians, like, you should treat them like brothers and sisters in Christ. And the way that you treat them does have an impact on their life.
Yeah. I've definitely
if you're saying that it's a heresy and that that Calvinists cannot be Christians, even then people treat Calvinists like they treat them worse than like Mormons.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think that they're lost, you should treat them like lost people and not just condemn them, but like preach the gospel to them.
Yeah.
And you might find that they believe the gospel too.
Right.
Yeah, but he wrote that in his book Total Depravity, that he did not believe that Adam was saved. And he said that all we know from the text is that he knew his wife, he had a son, and he died.
Yeah.
And so he says anyone that sees something more either has better sight than he does into the text, or has a more lively imagination. So,
well, we'll see today as we go through this text.
We'll see.
Right? We're looking at you called it the Gospel according to Genesis, and today we're going to see 4 paradoxes of the Gospel. But maybe describe what a paradox is first, because people may not be familiar with that.
Yeah, I tried to say it several times in the intro. It's a seemingly contradictory statement.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that it seems like it can't be true. like a self-defeating statement.
Mm-hmm.
Less is more. You've heard that before,
Right.
That's a paradox. You have to spend money to make money. It's a paradox.
Mm.
What else is there? Wow,
When
don't
I
know.
am weak, then I am strong.
Yeah, that's a paradox. Yeah, yeah. So they seem like those two parts of the sentence they can't like go together,
But they do.
but they do.
But they do.
Right.
Yeah.
And so as I was like studying and thinking through stuff, in our math curriculum, the kids were studying paradoxes, and so I was like, all right, well, let's see how this works.
Yeah.
So that's what I went with. Were 4 paradoxes that we see here in this text. I mean, spoiler alert, I think Adam and Eve were saved.
You gonna tell us right up front?
I disagree with A.W. Pink.
Yeah.
And I hope it's not because I have a more lively imagination than he did. Hopefully it's because this is the direction that the text is pointing us to.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds us that the gospel wasn't plan B. And that God hasn't changed his nature. I think that we can read about him being patient, merciful, and long suffering, and full of steadfast love. And I think some people can think about Adam and Eve, and they're outside of that. Like God was like that towards other people, but towards Adam and Eve, they're just worse than Hitler, right? And what they did is horrendous. I mean, it is the source of all suffering and sorrow and sickness and toil and death comes from them. But that doesn't mean that God's grace isn't sufficient to save them. And I think I think we can very subtly insert works-based salvation for Adam and Eve. Like, well, there's nothing that they could do to be saved.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And there's nothing you can do to be saved either. And so that's what we see in the text. That's why I called it the gospel according to Genesis, because that's what it is. It's the gospel. It's not Adam and Eve have to somehow earn their way back into God's favor, or they have to do something. They're saved the same way that everyone else is, by grace through faith in Christ.
Okay. And we're gonna see that today as we move through these paradoxes. So let's look at the first paradox of 4. Number 1 is found in verse 15. We see a Savior crushed yet risen. Is that how you phrased it?
Crushed yet raised.
Yet raised.
Yeah.
Okay. Savior crushed yet raised. And you brought up I think an interesting. To me, at least, is interesting, but it might not be to other people.
There was a lot of interesting things in these verses that I came across in my studies.
Yeah. So a little bit kind of overlapped with last week.
Right.
We see that there's this promise that's made. It's the first gospel that is preached by God himself, and it's a curse to the serpent that this serpent is going to be at war with the seed of this woman. But he's going to strike this promised one's heel,
right,
which would be a mortal, fatal wound.
But
in the process, his head is crushed, which is no coming back from.
Right.
Completely destroyed.
And I think we're supposed to see those next to each other. Like it's not accidental. I think you're supposed to see this juxtaposition between the crushing of the head and the crushing of the heel. And the crushing of the head it's final.
Right.
But the crushing of the heel it's fatal, because Moses is thinking about like venomous snakes. He's not thinking about harmless snakes. He's thinking about snakes that will kill you.
Right.
That Israel had a run-in with a bunch of snakes in the wilderness. But that contrast between head and heel, I think you're supposed to see something more going on there. But it is veiled. I mean, like as we're talking about the gospel, we are reading backwards also.
Right.
So we're taking some clues, but we're putting some pieces together. So yeah, I think we're supposed to see that, but how that all works out, it's not super clear to them
Yeah.
just in this verse.
So that kind of metaphor of being struck in the heel is drawn from actual serpents, but we know this is the serpent,
Right.
Like what we've
It
already
is the dragon.
established as the dragon or Satan, supernatural being,
Right.
Of immense power and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the curse is there's a enmity now, a war between this coming offspring, who the Bible describes as a he. So there's a coming he
Right.
that's going to crush your head, which is irreversible, fatal wound, total annihilation and destruction. And so now the Bible launches on this trajectory of the question is, who is the he that's going to come out of woman that's going to crush evil in the world?
Yeah.
And you brought up the interesting point. Why all the genealogies in the Bible?
Yeah.
And I think people think they just like to keep records. But that's not really what it's about.
Which, yeah, they are keeping records, and
Right.
it's important. Like after the exile, you see in Ezra and Nehemiah, they are, they've been scattered. Now they come back, and you got people that are like, "Well, yeah, I'm a Levite."
Yeah.
Well, prove it,
Right.
because it's very important that we only have Levites serving as priests in the temple, and so they have to prove from their genealogy that yes, I am descended from Levite, and we see in I think it's Nehemiah that there are guys who are claiming to be Levites that they can't prove it from their genealogy, and so until it can be proven, they're not able to eat from the food, the allotment given to the priest.
Yeah.
So they are keeping track, but I think that there's more going on there, because as you're going through, I mean, we're going to get to a genealogy in chapter 4. And as we trace these genealogies, there's it's tracing both the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And as it goes along, it starts with Adam and Seth, and it moves its way forward. Why? Because they're looking for this promise.
Right.
Like everything's rooted in this promise of Genesis 3:15, and it's very important because as Revelation progresses, you see that, well, first he's promised to be the seed of the woman, and so he just has to be a person. He has to be a human, right? But then we get to Abraham, and now he has to be from Abraham. So he has to be able to trace his lineage to a certain man in his family. And then it has to be through Isaac. And then you get to Jacob's prophecy in Genesis 49, and now he has to come through Judah. And then you get to David, and he has to come from David. And so you've got, like, it keeps contracting. And so it's wide at the beginning, and it keeps narrowing it down until he actually shows up.
Right.
And what does the New Testament start with? A genealogy.
Right.
Why? It's not just to keep record. It's to show that he's the one. And here he is from David. He is from Abraham. And if you get to Luke's genealogy, he traces it all the way back to Adam.
Right.
And so the purpose of these genealogies is not so that they were so interested in genealogies that the writer of Chronicles is like, everyone's going to want to read 9 chapters of names.
Yeah.
No, it's to keep track of the promise.
The promise of who's coming, and then no more genealogies after Christ.
Yeah,
I saw recently this guy's kind of a popular younger atheist from Oxford. I think he's trying to take up the mantle of the old guard that's going away. But he this is one of the things he brought up, and he was like, "Look, your New Testament has 2 different genealogies in it. They can't even agree. They're like, can you answer that?" And the guy was like, "That's easy to answer." He's like, the King of England traces genealogy back to Alfred the Great, like the unifier that, when you had the divided Saxon kingdoms. Well, he unified it into, England. You can trace his genealogy back to Alfred the Great in like 3 different ways.
Oh, really?
Because of the marriages and who's related to who.
Yeah.
So if you write out his genealogy, you can easily do 3 like legitimate different ones.
Right.
Like this is not a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they're doing Matthew and Luke are doing 2 different things also.
Yeah.
Matthew's goal is to show that he is the promised seed of David. Luke is tracing it all the way back to Adam
Mm-hmm.
and showing how he's the promised seed for all humanity, because
Yeah.
Luke's focused on Gentiles,
Right.
and you can see where they diverge.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look at our genealogy, like if you start going back far enough, like you're starting to it's going to diverge, but you're just following a certain person. Well, who are you going to follow? Like which grandfather do you want to follow?
Right.
Right? Which great grandfather? And it just keeps going out and becoming
then they
more and more
reconnect.
broad. Yeah. So you can see the difference between Matthew's genealogy that traces Jesus from Solomon and Luke's genealogy that traces him from Nathan. That's where it diverges.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, I think, believe that Luke's tracing him from Mary. I don't know.
Probably to emphasize the seed promise.
Yeah. And if Luke is a historian and Mary's still alive, then he could have interviewed her,
Right.
and gotten a genealogy.
Yeah.
So, there's different ways to explain it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you're going to discount Christianity because of genealogies, I don't know.
Yeah.
You probably have deeper problems.
True.
Yeah,
enough.
he has to. I mean, this verse is the thesis statement of the Bible. This is the verse that all the rest of the story springs from. And so when we're thinking about, I mean, we're going to start reading about barrenness in Genesis. Why is that such a an emphasis? Like Sarah is barren, Rebecca is barren, Rachel is barren. Why all these women who are barren? It's because there's a problem. The problem is, how's the seed of the woman going to come if the promised line, the women can't have kids?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big problems. It's the war is more than just Cain kills Abel. The war is that because of the fall, there's all kinds of problems that I'm not sure how we're going to do it yet, because it's a long chapter that has to be held together. But what is it? Genesis 24 is Abraham sending his servant to look for a wife for Isaac. Why is this chapter so long, and why is it so important? Well, Isaac is the promised seed of Abraham, and if he can't find a wife, then he can't have a kid. And how's the problem? How's the promise going to be fulfilled? So when we're reading these stories, they may not even seem very connected to what's going on, but they all trace back to Genesis 3:15. And so you have to read it in light of the fact that there's this overarching promise that this one is going to come, and he's going to make everything right.
Yeah.
And so all these stories, they fit together as they're following this promise.
Mm.
And the problems that arise, we should see them in light of God said that this one's going to come. And you got Abraham, who's super old, and his wife is barren.
Mm-hmm.
But he said he's the one. He's the one that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him. That's connected to Genesis 3:15. There's a problem that Abraham and Sarah aren't going to be able to solve through human ingenuity. God has to do something.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, you picked up on that in Romans chapter 4.
Right.
Like his body was as good as dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, God had to do something.
Yeah. It's a sign.
Yeah.
It's always it's like a sign where this story progresses in key significant ways. God gives validating signs, and there is that thread of an impossible pregnancy,
Right.
which comes to its climax in Christ being born of a virgin.
Yeah.
There's nothing more impossible than that. I mean, an old 90-year-old lady
Right.
is pretty impossible, but she's still, it's still happening the normal way.
Yeah, she still has a husband.
Yeah. And so, that sign it becomes to a climax in the coming of Christ. And,
Right.
and that's what you were emphasizing, this is a human male coming from a woman, and it's really emphasized by the author of Hebrews.
Yeah. We had to go to Hebrews.
Yeah.
I mean, it just wouldn't be it just doesn't feel right without going to Hebrews a couple of times.
When you're writing a sermon, you kind of have your background information that you're
Mhm.
pulling from cross references from, like, automatically.
Yeah.
Yours is set to default
It's default to
to
Hebrews.
Hebrews.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was putting it together, I was like, all right, he has to be a human male, and people are going to be like, obviously, but that's not a throwaway. Um, that's not a throwaway fact. Like, he has to be a human male, and the reason is because Adam was a human male,
Right.
and he was the federal head of all humanity. And so
Mhm.
in his sin, all of humanity fell.
Mhm.
And the only way for that to be redeemed is for a human male to be the last Adam.
Mhm.
He has to be like Adam, and instead of sinning, he has to obey in order to redeem the human race. And so Hebrews chapter 2 emphasizes the fact that the role of man was to take dominion. Like, you've made him for a little while lower than the angels, but you've crowned him with glory and honor. Like, that was what Adam was supposed to be. He failed. He didn't do that, but that doesn't mean that God's plan is scrapped. His purpose is still for mankind to take dominion. It's just not going to be Adam. It's going to be a new man.
Mhm.
And so Jesus has to be made truly a man. He has to be truly human, and that's what the rest of Hebrews chapter 2 is dealing with. Is that he had to be made like us in every way except without sin, so that he could destroy the works of the devil. I mean,
Mhm.
he even ties it back to Genesis 3:15.
Mhm.
Like, Jesus is the seed of the woman who crushes the head of the serpent. But in order to do that, he has to be truly a man. He has to be fully man. Because if he doesn't have a body and a mind and a soul just like you and me, then he's not able to redeem our body, mind, and soul.
Mhm.
So he had to be. I mean, the emphasis is he had to be. This wasn't just one option among many. He had to be. This was the only way that he could redeem his brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
He had to be made like us.
Yeah.
Philip was talking about it in Sunday school with the youth. They just lined up. Incarnation was what he was talking about, and he mentioned Anselm of Canterbury, who wrote "Why the God Man," which I mentioned when I preached Hebrews 2,
Mhm.
because that's the point. Why does he have to be a man? Well, he has to be a man because we're people, we're humans. Like, he couldn't be an angel because Hebrews 2 even says he didn't come to save the angels. He didn't come to help the angels. He came to help Abraham's offspring. So he can't be an angel. He has to be a man.
Mhm.
He can't be an animal. Why do bulls and goats not ultimately save people? Because we're not bulls and goats. Like, the wages of sin is death, and only the death of a man, a perfect man, can actually accomplish it. Can
Yeah.
actually redeem his people from death.
Yeah. So we see that. We see also you brought out that he's the seed of the woman, which is, I think, even to people who aren't well read in theology, sounds strange. It's a strange way to phrase it.
Yeah,
This is usually the offspring of the man,
the man,
or the
right?
seed of the man.
Yeah, Adam's not even in the.
Yeah.
He's not even in the equation here. Which doesn't mean that they're not going to have kids through the normal biological way, but there seems to be something here that is at least worthy of our reflection, because we know from further revelation that Jesus was born of a virgin. I think there might be at least a really veiled indication of that here in verse 15.
It's a little Easter egg.
A little. Like, you can look back,
Yeah.
because you read. I mean, you read through even Genesis. It's the seed of Abraham. Get to David. It's the seed of David. But here it's the seed of the woman, and it is different than what you see in the rest of the scriptures. Even when you read the book of Ruth, and Ruth is like the main character. When it comes to the offspring, it's Boaz.
Yeah.
Because that's how they counted the offspring is from the dad. And so that slight shift in in emphasis away from Adam to the woman. I think it is intended to start us thinking about it.
Right.
And then ultimately, Christ comes from the woman, apart from the man.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. He is at war with the dragon was the next kind of point of the gospel that's pronounced by God. That there's going to be this war. We've already emphasized it and talked about it. But he will never not be at war in enmity against the dragon. He will not give in. He will only be in a state of hostility toward this dragon.
Right. How else? If he just follows Adam and Eve, because they just have given into the dragon. If he just repeats their pattern, then he can't actually restore all things, because he's going to be in some way dominated by the dragon. And so the fact that he's going to be at war with the dragon indicates that he's going to be righteous, that he's not going to be a sinner. Which again, we're getting just glimpses. We're just getting quick glimpses of this coming one, because this is the beginning. We're going to follow progressive revelation, looking for the righteous seed of the woman who's going to accomplish this. But we get little pieces of it here in 15. If we stop and think about what does this actually mean, that he's going to be at war with the dragon. He's going to have enmity between him and the serpent. It has to mean that he's going to live counter to what Adam and Eve have done.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Now, the last one, I did not get scratched down all the way for whatever reason. I got resurrection through, and then I missed the last word.
Well, I mean, if he's crushing the head of the serpent,
is it conflict?
I didn't really.
Conflict?
Well,
I can't remember how you phrased it.
I just put the war will reach a climax. I don't know. I don't have anything. I mean, I don't know what. I don't know. I've got a bunch of stuff here. I don't have anything like in bold or anything.
All right. I made up a fourth.
That's a certain phrase.
I made up a fourth bold point for you.
Well, it is. It's the fourth point is that last phrase. He will crush your head. You will crush his heel.
Yeah.
And we talked about it kind of already. Like the snake is, if he bites you on the heel, it's venomous. You're going to die. But that distinction between head and heel is that the serpent's wound is done. But since it's on the heel, something more is going to happen to this hero. He's going to die because he's been struck by the serpent. But that contrast between head and heel indicates, at least again in a very veiled way, that death is not final for the seed of the woman. And we know from further revelation that he conquers the dragon on the cross, where he dies under the serpent's venomous fangs. But in his resurrection, he crushes the dragon.
Yeah, the venom of the serpent is death.
Right.
That death has come to all mankind.
Yeah.
And that's what he takes into himself.
Right.
The curse of the dragon.
Yeah.
And through it, defeat. And I love that. I love how it goes. Can you you try to think back, what was this dragon's thought of what's going to happen when he
I don't know.
execute this master plan to kill the promised seed?
Well, I think because it is veiled. Maybe he doesn't. I mean, he's not omnipotent and omniscient. Like, he doesn't know everything.
Yeah.
So it may be veiled enough that he either doesn't know, or he thinks that he can
win.
He can
thinks
win.
He can win. Blinded by
because
pride.
he's proud.
Blinded by his pride.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He may think that, well, if I can kill him, he can't do it.
And I love the way God works in that. It's that in the evil you've worked, you're going to destroy yourself. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like God's
the way,
master irony.
And that's the way that God that's the way God works. I mean, it is like through paradoxes. The gospel is just filled with paradoxes because it's in death that Christ overcomes.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make any sense to the world.
Right.
Like you don't you if you die, then you haven't really been victorious.
Yeah.
But through death, Christ has overcome, and because of Christ's death and resurrection, through death we overcome also.
Mm-hmm.
We defeat the dragon by not loving life, and it's that's just the power of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find this picture. You've probably seen it before. I'm trying to find it of Jesus on the cross with the serpent.
Oh, with the spike through his head into his feet.
Yeah, there it is. Let's see if I can pull this up. Well, there we go. I love this picture. Like this, like that's the perfect picture of Genesis 3:15.
Yeah,
is that he thinks he's won.
Yeah.
But he's actually been, his head's been crushed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a cool picture.
And it's right there. It's right there in Genesis 3:15. Like that is the first gospel. It's announced by God to the dragon, and it carries the whole story forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so the gospel is not it's not the story of Jesus is not just another story in the Bible. Like it is the story.
Mm-hmm.
The story of Christ's death and resurrection is the story. And so as we're reading everything else, we need to see how does it fit into this story, because this is where it's all going. It's all going with the seed of the woman who's going to crush the head of the serpent, and so all these other stories are meant to be viewed in light of that. And some of them are more obvious, like David and Goliath. I mean, Goliath is even described as wearing scale armor. Like
Right.
the Hebrew word is like the word for scales. Like he's a big dragon. And what does David do? He crushes his head.
Yeah.
And like 4 times in the text it talks about David cutting off his head.
Uh-huh.
Like you're supposed to, it's so obvious. But there are less obvious ones. But it still fits into this story. So like Mordecai and Haman,
Mm-hmm.
like that's maybe a less obvious one. Like Haman is the seed of the serpent, and he tries to kill Mordecai by raising up this stake to hang him on it.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to him?
Yeah, he hangs.
He
on
gets
his
hung
own,
on it.
on his own devices.
He gets hung on it, and Mordecai gets exalted.
Yeah.
And so you've got stories just trying to connect those to Genesis 3:15 will open up the meaning for these stories and connect it to the overarching narrative.
Then you have Jael crushing the head of.
Jael literally puts a tent peg through Sisera's head.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's a woman,
Uh-huh.
which connects us back to the story, and she crushes the head of the enemy. In Judges also, Abimelech, Gideon's son, tries to become king, and what happens to him? A woman throws a millstone down on his head and crushes his head.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that's what's going to happen to all pretender kings.
Right.
Like he's not, Abimelech is not the king of Israel. He's a pretender king, and all pretender kings are going to face that.
Mm. Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to the second paradox then. The second paradox is found in verse 20, a woman condemned yet living. A woman condemned yet living. And you drew out of this Eve's name.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't think about it, but this is the second name. He named her already once, and now Adam names her again.
Right. And I have tried my very hardest. I don't know if I slipped up any. I think I slipped up once on the podcast, but I tried in all these sermons leading up to here to not call her Eve. Because up to now, she's just been the woman or Adam's wife. And now he names her a second time, and it does have theological significance. So I didn't want to lessen that significance by just casually using her name. before he actually names her.
Yeah.
Because he names her here and he names her Eve for a reason, I think. And I think it indicates that though God promises this head crushing savior, he directs it to the serpent. Adam's in the vicinity, like he's hearing this promise, and I think verse 20 is his response of faith. Because we have to ask the question, well, what about when God said, on the day you eat of this tree, you'll die, you'll surely die, and here they are, they're still alive, and he calls his wife's name Eve, which means living. It sounds very similar to the Hebrew word for living, and it even tells us because she was the mother of all living. What about the curse of death? What's going on there? And so I think that all of that pours theological meaning into this.
Yeah. Because there is a sense, though, as we look at it, and I think it's a valid question people probably had. Well, they didn't die, but we see that they did die.
Yeah.
Like they had a spiritual death.
Right.
They're separated from God now.
Mm-hmm.
They're really they're incomplete.
Yeah.
Like if you're created in God's image and you were created to manifest in the world the glory of God. We're going to get into that in the next chapter in Romans. Because in Romans, what do we fall short of? The glory of God. And then what do we hope in? The glory of God. And that's more than just seeing, I believe, and knowing God is glorious, which he is. It's a return. Like Romans and Genesis are linked in a lot of ways, as we'll see. And so they've lost that. They're now separated, distant from God. So they have a spiritual death. That should be obvious. And then they're exiled, never to return to God's, to what we would say is like the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
This proximity is gone. But also, I think a thing we need to remember is that they will die.
Right.
We forget about that. It's longer, it's protracted, which I think we're going to bring out. You brought it out, says something more about God than us. But every human that's ever lived dies. I mean, except for like Enoch, right?
Right.
Who else? Elijah. But everyone else dies.
Right.
Every human will experience the curse that God promised what would happen. Now, that's protracted, and that really tells us something about God.
Yeah. And I think that we can gloss over the fact that he didn't just immediately strike them down.
Right.
Like they did. They deserve it. They've earned death.
Yeah.
Like the wages of sin is death, and they've earned every penny.
Yeah.
And for God not to do it immediately should remind us that God is merciful.
Yeah.
Like this is not something that we see later on in the Bible. We see it at the very beginning. God is merciful to Adam and his wife, and he doesn't kill them. He tells them that they will die. Like he's told Adam in verse 19 that you'll work the ground until you return to the dust. Yeah. Like you will die. In verses 22 through 24, he's going to exile them from the garden and from the tree of life. So they're barred from eating from the tree of life and living forever. So they will die. But this is the paradox, right? The woman is condemned, and yet she's living. Yeah. And even more, there's a promise coming from her that more than just she will live.
Yeah. And I liked how you brought this out, that this is probably an expression of faith on Adam's part.
Yeah, I
that
think
he's
so.
He's believing and trusting God's promise.
So how else could you get from verse 19, which says you're going to die, you're going to go back to the dust, to verse 20 where he turns around and says, you're now going to be called the living one. Yeah. Like how do you reconcile those two? It's because he heard verse 15. And he's promised that someone is coming from not there's going to be many children. Right? Verse 16 says that God's going to multiply her pain in childbearing, so she's going to give birth to kids, which in itself is God's mercy. Like this is not the end of the human race. It could have easily have been like, well, there's two, That's a failed attempt. We'll kill them and we'll start over again. But God continues the line of Adam. But there's also going to come one who, out of the woman, who is going to save everyone. He's going to save his people. And I think Adam naming his wife Eve is a response of faith in that.
Yeah.
And so he is calling her the living one, because out of her is going to come one who's going to bring life. And so I think Adam is he's repenting and he's believing on Christ.
Yeah.
I think he's believing
And
on
I think
the promise of Christ.
That is an interesting angle to look at. And also Eve, in her naming of her children, that brings something out about her possibly having saving faith, right?
Yeah, very interesting. I probably spent more time studying this than I should have, for it just being one little section of one point of the sermon. But so if Adam is responding in faith, what about Eve? Is she responding in faith? And for that, we have to go to chapter 4, and her naming her children. And what's really fascinating is her naming of Cain. Mm-hmm. And so in chapter 4, verse 1, it says that Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. So Cain's name means got or obtained. But there's some weird grammar going on. And I pulled it up here so we could pull it up on the screen so you can see it.
Go like this on your screen with pinch and go out. See if it'll zoom.
Oh, goodness. What did you make me do?
If you go like that, will
now
it
doesn't want to do anything.
It won't?
Now it's stuck.
Oh, no.
There we go. All right, let's see it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is Genesis 4, verse 1. I am not a Hebrew scholar at all, so I'll try to explain this the best I can, but I think I understand it well enough to explain it.
But you know how to read.
I do know how to read.
And you know how to read
I'm glad
people
you know. I'm glad
that
you know.
you know how to read people that are experts.
Right, yeah.
And you understand enough of Hebrew to
Yeah,
understand what they're saying.
Yes, yeah. All right, so it says that, so she conceived and she bore Cain. Right here, here's Cain's name, and said, I have acquired. There's his name. You can see there's Cain and Cana, so got or obtained, a man. And here's where it gets interesting. You've got this word right here, et. So et Yahweh. And if you're watching, we're reading right to left.
Right.
Just to remind people, that's how we read Hebrew. And the question is, how are we supposed to translate this word et? The ESV has, I've acquired a man with the help of Yahweh. With the help of has to be supplied. So if you're using like the New American Standard or the Legacy Standard, you'll see it's in italics. So it tells you these are not actually the words in the text. It's been supplied for you to help go from Hebrew to English. But that's a translator choice, and it's not the only choice that they could have gone with. So et is it can be translated as a preposition. So it can be with, or from, or of. But it also can be, if we'll go back up here, it also can be a direct object right here. And when it's a direct object, it's untranslatable. Like it's just a direct object marker. And so here, and she bore et Cain. Well, it's not with Cain or from Cain or of Cain. Like it's not. It can't be translated as a preposition. The same thing is. Let's see if I can go to the next. The same thing is over here in verse 2 with Abel. It's untranslatable twice with Abel. She again bore his brother right here, and there's this direct object marker, Abel, and there it is again, et, twice, and both times it's untranslatable. So 3 times in 2 verses it's untranslatable, and then you've got the one in verse 1 that is translated as with or from or of, And the question is, should it be untranslatable also? Should it be a direct object? And again, it's kind of a like there's nothing in the text that tells you one way or the other. So it's a translator's choice.
Yeah.
How are we going to translate it? So what's really interesting is that if you don't translate it, it says, I have gotten a man, Yahweh.
Mm.
And that's wild.
Yeah.
And before we say, well, that's just an outlier, the Jewish Targum of Palestine, which is not a Christian document at all, right, actually translates this verse. I had to go look it up. I was like, I'm not taking someone else's word on this. I actually want to see it. And it says, I have gotten the angel of the Lord.
Mm.
What is going on here, Jay? What is he? What is this Targum suggesting that Eve believes about her firstborn son?
Right.
That he's the angel of the Lord? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
I don't know. Or if it's I've gotten a man, Yahweh, which it would be that would be it would mean that man and Yahweh are appositional. So man and Yahweh are just saying the same thing twice. If that's the case, then Eve has a very high Christology at the very beginning of the Bible, right? Like she believes that the seed of the woman is actually going to be in some way Yahweh in the flesh.
Right. Yeah.
You don't hear about that stuff very often,
Right.
right? Like the Trinity is something that most modern theologians are like, well, it's hinted at, but it's not really really there.
Right.
Same with the incarnation. Like, well, they didn't know that he's going to be God in the flesh.
Right.
Like,
But
well, I don't know.
yeah, except for we have I think it's Isaiah chapter 9, which says he'll be called Wonderful Counselor,
Almighty God,
Mighty God.
right?
So a baby born who is God.
Yeah,
like it's there. But here, what is interesting to think about is we aren't told. We're told only what we have before us in the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we aren't told was
we don't know what's going on in her head.
Yes, or if they were after this, it was elaborated more to them,
right?
What to be looking for.
Yeah,
but it seems to be that you brought out she had good theology, but with wrong timing.
Right.
Wrong timing. So believing, okay, this one who is to come, who's going to destroy the dragon, is going to be
immediately here.
Like, yeah, she thinks Yahweh is coming in the flesh.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe she believes
it could
this.
be. I would probably lean more towards Martin Luther. He said, I've obtained the man of Yahweh.
The man of Yahweh.
Which is a little less high Christology of like the incarnation.
Right.
But it still is suggesting that she believes that her firstborn is the seed of the
promised seed. That's the important thing to emphasize.
Right.
And that's what you're trying to
draw. This is really interesting, and we can think about this. And I mean, the fact that the Jewish Targum translates it that way is beyond belief for me, because it just emphasizes the fact that the Jewish rabbis after AD 70 have some radically different theology from the rabbis before AD 70.
Right.
Like they really pull back on any kind of Christological emphasis.
Right. As a counter, you could call it a counter Reformation against the Christians.
Yeah,
they tried to remove that stuff from
but
the
it was there. That's the thing that people need to know is like the Jews of Jesus's day, they had better theology than we often give them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
Like their problem wasn't even like Trinitarian. Like they had a bigger problem with the incarnation than with the Trinity, because of the Old Testament and the angel of the Lord and all of that. But I think however we translate it, I think that the emphasis is Eve believes that her firstborn is the seed of the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Like
the promise.
Yeah, she thinks that he's the one.
Yeah,
and so and that indicates that she's believing Genesis 3:15. She's believing the gospel. Right. She's hoping in the seed of the woman who's going to come. Now, as we go into chapter 4, in a month, we'll see. Obviously, Cain isn't,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that her doctrine is wrong. It just means that her timing is off. And I think we see the same thing at the end of Genesis chapter 5 when Lamech names Noah, because he names Noah, which means rest, because this one is going to bring us rest
Yeah.
from all the toil which God brought on the earth. Or I can't remember the exact phrasing.
Uh-huh.
So it seems like Lamech believes that his son is the seed of the woman.
Yeah.
Now, again, Noah doesn't bring quite the promised rest, right?
Right.
He brings a kind of rest, but not the promised rest of Genesis 3:15. So Lamech's doctrine is right also. He's looking for the seed of the woman also. His timing is just off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know why Lamech thinks that his son is going to be the seed of the woman, but he obviously is still picking up on Genesis 3:15 and believing it. But Eve, remember, she hasn't had any kids.
Yeah.
Like, this is the first one that she's had, and so she's conflating the promise of multiple offspring to one offspring, and the Messiah is immediately going to come. Which, can you fault her for that? I mean, I don't think we can blame her for that.
Right. Yeah.
But we can see that she's a woman who is believing.
Hmm.
I think that she actually is believing on Christ.
Hmm.
Martin Luther says the same thing. He takes that same position, as that she's believing. She doesn't call him her son. She calls him the man of the Lord. She calls him the man of Yahweh.
Yeah.
Because she believes that this one is going to be the Messiah.
All right.
Which is just, I just started looking at all kinds of commentaries and trying to find out what is going on here, and it's really interesting. It's really interesting.
You had fun, huh? You had a fun.
There's if anyone wants to look at a long article on this, answering the question of whether Adam and Eve were saved, Ben Carlson from Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary wrote an article about a year ago, and he lays out a lot of this stuff.
Cool. Yeah, that's cool.
Also, when Cain kills Abel, Eve's response, she has another child, Seth, and her response there is that she has given birth to another son because God has what does Seth's name mean? Help me out here, Jay. What is it? Appointed. Seth's name means appointed because God has appointed another offspring. It's the word for seed. He's appointed another seed. So even though Cain's not the one and Abel's not the one, she's still believing the promise. She's even after the horrendous murder of Abel, and Cain is exiled even further east. So those two that she was hoping in, it's not either of them. She still believes that God is still going to keep his promise, and the seed is still going to come.
It is very interesting to look at.
So,
for sure.
So I think Adam and Eve were both believing Genesis 3:15, that's the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. All right, the third paradox then is verse 21: a couple naked yet clothed. A couple naked yet clothed, and so we see the effects immediately. They do realize good and evil, but they realize they're evil, and they're hiding in their shame and in their guilt. They're trying to hide from God.
Yeah,
and they make
fig leaf underwear,
which kind of is kind of an archetype of human works religion.
Right,
it's really what it is. They're trying to make their guilt go away.
Right. They're trying to cover their shame the best way that they know how.
Yeah. So they pull from that, and you drew out, I think importantly, they don't go to an animal to cover their shame. It would never have crossed their mind, right?
I think that it's you got to read between the lines. Like, why did Adam and Eve get fig leaves?
Yeah.
Like, that was their first thought. Their first thought wasn't, let's clothe ourselves with something a little sturdier.
Right.
Because we're so used to death and the this kind of stuff that we're like, it doesn't even
It doesn't
the
phase.
the
It doesn't
question
even phase us.
yeah, it doesn't phase us. We don't even ask the question like, why didn't they clothe themselves with animal skins?
Right.
Because death is
Nothing's
that's a sign of God's judgment.
They haven't seen anything die.
And I think that, I mean, I didn't bring it out, but another argument I think for young Earth, like, they haven't seen death. They haven't seen something die. Death is the result of God's anger, of judgment, and so it wouldn't even cross their mind to go and kill an animal and wear its skins. Like, we're so unfazed by that. Like, I've got a leather bag in my office. Like, we don't even think about the fact that we wear animal skins.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Adam and Eve were the first members of PETA.
Yeah. So they're
but
naked.
they're not. That's not their initial reaction, because death is not something to met out themselves.
Right.
This is, God said, on the day you eat of it, you'll die, and so they don't just turn around and kill an animal and clothe themselves with its skins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is interesting to think about. But what in their failed attempts to do, God does something for them that they can't do. He clothes their nakedness, and the detail is there. He clothes them with skins.
Yeah, garments of skins. Yeah. Like, we have to, like, he makes for them. So he's this is not, he's not creating out of nothing.
Right.
Like, he kills an animal and he clothes them with garments of skins. I didn't bring it out, but I mean, this is condescension on God's part. Like, you got to get this, that the first death in the Bible is not Adam and Eve. That's what we expect. We expect on the day you eat of it, you'll die. They're not the first thing to die. An animal dies. I was asked this past week, what kind of animal do I think it was, because we're not told. But I think Israel would have seen in this exactly what it is, sacrificial language. And so if someone were to force me to answer, I'd probably say a goat or a lamb, because it's sacrificed.
Well, and that's the pattern that unfolds in.
Yeah, and who sacrifices? God sacrifices an animal that dies instead of them.
Right.
And then he clothes their nakedness. He takes their fig leaves away and gives them, like, actual clothing. And this is absolutely tabernacle language.
Yeah.
Even the idea of garments of skins, clothing, these people, has priestly allusions. Like, you have to remember that Israel's come out of Egypt. They've probably already been to Mount Sinai. Moses is probably writing this sometime in the wilderness wanderings. And so the temple, or the tabernacle, sacrifices and the priests, that it's already going. And one of the things that God tells Moses is that the people are supposed to make garments for the priest to cover their nakedness, so that they won't die, so they won't bear their guilt and die. Well, what connection would they have drawn?
All right.
Like, Adam was a priest. He's now naked. He has to be clothed lest he die. Who's going to do it? God does it.
Yeah.
So there's this one verse is just packed with theology, because Adam and his wife are clothed with their own works that are this is poor clothing. Like, this is not going to work. God has to do something for them that they can't do. He kills an animal, sacrifice, and then he clothes them with the skins of that animal. And this has Day of Atonement language from Leviticus 16. And then if we carry it all the way into the New Testament, we have substitutionary sacrifice and imputation. And it's all right there in verse 21.
Yeah, it is.
Like, God takes this sacrifice and he clothes the guilty sinners with the skins of this animal.
Right.
And that's exactly what we see in the gospel, is that Christ dies as a sacrifice for our sins. God imputing or crediting or placing our sins on Jesus so that he dies for our sins.
Yeah.
And then God takes his righteousness and he literally clothes us with the righteousness of Christ and covers our guilt. And so now when God looks at us, he sees us clothed in the righteousness of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all in a type here in verse 21.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to look at and to think about all the stuff that is packed into these few verses.
Yeah.
That are just
repeated
and elaborated on and expand until we get to Christ.
Yeah. One commentator I read he's a pretty it's Derek Kidner. He's pretty conservative. I use him for Psalms quite often. He said it's a distraction to see in this verse anything other than God just clothing them so that they can go out into the world. But nothing in this chapter has been just material.
Right.
None of it has been just physical. I mean, Eve is not eating from the fruit because she's hungry. Like, she's got everything she needs. She wants moral autonomy from God.
Right.
That their nakedness is not just physical nakedness. Like, they're hiding from God because they recognize that they're guilty. There's a spiritual reality to it. And the clothing here is more than just, yes, they do need clothes to go out into the world. And God is gracious to them in this, but they need more than just clothes. They need the imputation of God's righteousness. And they need something spiritual, because God is not just, he's not unconcerned by their physical reality, but that's not his ultimate concern. His ultimate concern for his image bearers is the spiritual reality. They've been separated from him, and something has to be done to bring them back.
Right. Yeah. And that brings us to our fourth paradox. In 22 through 24, we see a people exiled yet drawn near. Is that how you phrased it?
Invited near.
Invited near. A people exiled yet invited near. And so this section ends with a very vivid portrayal. They're cast out of the garden to the east, and there are more burning ones, the cherubim, who are placed in the way so that no man can come back.
Yeah.
They can't get back to the garden where God is. Where God is, that proximity to God. They cannot get back to the tree of life and eat it and live forever. And it's guarded by centuries.
Yeah.
Angelic guardians.
Like unbeatable.
Yeah.
Unbeatable soldiers.
Yeah.
One commentary I read said, because when you see cherubim and flames next, you'll see it in Ezekiel chapter 1. And there they've got 4 different faces and four wings, and their legs are glowing like bronze, and there's flashes of fire around them, which is probably lightning. And so one commentator I read said that the flaming sword may be lightning. And so you can imagine this garden entryway and these shining, horrible looking angels and lightning bolts striking. That's going to keep you out. You're not going to be able to get in.
Yeah.
It also has Sinai language to it, where the angels are there and there's flames and lightning, and you can imagine this is foreboding. And it's guarding, just like the cherubim guard the throne of God in Ezekiel. It's guarding the Holy of Holies. This is where God is. And
that imagery, you brought it out, is in the temple.
Yeah, it's picked up again. So you remember the garden is described as a temple. It's a garden temple. It's like a sanctuary. I would suggest that where the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the Holy of Holies. That's where Adam and Eve would have had communion with God. It's facing east, just like Israel's tabernacle. And at the entry of the sanctuary are cherubim. And if you look at Exodus with the building of the tabernacle, there's the outer courtyard, and they've got the sanctuary, the holy place, and the holy of holies. And the dividing between the holy place and the holy of holies is a big curtain, big thick curtain, and embroidered on that curtain are cherubim. So you've got cherubim that are blocking the way to the holy of holies. And then if you were to go into the holy of holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat, where the blood of the Day of Atonement sacrifice is sprinkled to atone for the sins. It's the footstool of God. It's where God dwells. And what's on top of it? 2 golden cherubim with their wings outstretched, guarding the place where God is. Right. So it's you're following this story of God's place and being barred from it with cherubs, and how you get back, because they've been exiled.
Right.
They've been driven out of the garden to the east, which is a significant, like everyone's going to go to the east in Genesis. Adam and Eve go east. Cain goes east. After Noah's flood, the people build a tower in the east. It's not until Genesis chapter 12 that one man goes west. And so there's a significance with the direction. So they're going east, and Israel, when they're exiled, they go east. And so going east is it's exile. It's the wrong way. You're going the wrong way. You're going out of the garden. And so all this has tabernacle and temple imagery, and it's going to be repeated in Israel's experience. They've been brought out of Egypt. They've been given God's law. He's going to put them in the promised land that's described like a garden paradise. They're told, if you obey, you'll experience blessings in life, and if you disobey, you'll experience curses and death. They disobey.
Yeah.
And they're exiled to the east, outside of the promised land. And so they're just repeating the same pattern of Adam. So how do they come back? How do they come back into God's presence? Well, tabernacle language, they come through sacrifice. They come through the sacrificial system, where the high priest, he enters into the Holy of Holies behind the curtain one time a year with blood for the sins of the people. But that's not good enough, because the blood of bulls and goats can't actually atone for the sins of humans, like we've already talked about. Right? And so God sends the seed of the woman.
Yeah.
And what Jesus does is that he offers a sacrifice not of animals, but he offers the sacrifice of himself, of his own body and blood. And we went back to Hebrews again, Hebrews 9 and 10. Jesus, he enters into the true holy place, not the physical one that's a copy on earth, but the true one up in heaven. And his life and death are presented as the means to now draw near to God's throne. And we see the visible outworking of that when Christ dies, and the curtain that has those embroidered cherubs on it rips down
from top to bottom.
From top to bottom, indicating that the cherubs have now parted. Yeah. And now access to God is available. But it's only available through Christ.
You're right.
It's only available through sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's been suggested that Adam and Eve didn't move very far outside the garden, which when we get to Cain in chapter 4, and he murders his brother, God confronts him. It's Genesis 3 all over again. And he leaves east. And it actually says he goes out of Eden to the east, which suggests that before that, they were still in Eden. You remember that the garden is just one part of Eden.
Yeah.
So they've been exiled east of the garden. That's what it says in verse 24. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden. So he can't go into the garden, but Eden is still there. They may still been in close proximity. And Cain and Abel are going to offer animal sacrifice. Abel's going to offer animal sacrifice in chapter 4. Where do you learn to do that? Well, the first animal sacrifice is in verse 21. Adam may have also offered animal sacrifices. Well, where would he have done it?
Yeah.
Well, maybe at the entrance to the garden where God is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of this is conjecture. Like we don't know for certain, but just reading between the lines and putting pieces together, it seems at least likely that Abel learns to offer animal sacrifices from his father offering animal sacrifices, because the pattern's been set up in verse 21. How can sinners be atoned for? It's through something has to die, and God establishes animal sacrifices to point forward to the seed of the woman who will come and actually atone through his sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah. It is pretty amazing. Like the amount of stuff that is here that we often just have read through.
Yeah,
not really.
It's a familiar story.
Meditated upon it, thought about it deeply. It's very interesting. Yeah.
But when you think about that question, what happened to Adam and Eve, it's really easy for us to be like, well, what they did was so horrendous, so heinous that there's no way that they could ever be saved.
Yeah.
But that's the gospel. Like that is the gospel. The gospel is that God has done for sinners what sinners could never do for themselves by sending Christ to die for their sins, and not just the little sins. Like Christ's death is so powerful and so sufficient that it overturns Adam's sin. And that's what you're going to get to in Romans chapter 5.
Yeah.
I thought about doing something with Romans 5 in the sermon, but it's like Jay's going to be in it for weeks, and so it's all there. I mean, even we have access to this grace. Like it's through Christ. Like the access that was denied because of these cherubs, we now have it through Christ.
Yeah.
And the whole point of 12 through 21 is that Christ's death is superior to Adam's sin. Well, is it not powerful enough to redeem Adam and Eve? I think it is.
Wow. Yeah, it is good. I think you did a good job of answering that question.
Thanks.
Yeah. Because if anyone is hopeless, like we always hold on to, like, it's just part of our human nature. We aren't hopeless, really, are we?
Yeah.
Like, we haven't done anything too awful.
Yeah.
But we know they've done something that is, in our minds, unforgivable.
Right. Yeah.
So if that promise is powerful enough to save these people, the world breakers, that's what I'm calling Adam.
Yeah.
Adam, the world breaker, Christ, the world redeemer. You can be saved by this promise.
There's no sin that there's no one that's too far gone.
Yeah.
If Adam and Eve are not too far gone, then there's no one that's outside of God's grace.
Yeah. And that was good. All right. Well, thanks, George.
Yep.
It was really good. This section was great. If you enjoy the podcast, you can also just go back and listen to those sermons. Those are available on our Christ Fellowship. It's called Christ Fellowship Church of Lawton. There's an app, and you can listen to all the sermons there if you want to actually hear the sermon. But, of course, the Text Driven Tuesday comes out every week. So thanks for tuning in. If this has been a blessing to you, if you've learned from it, return to us a kindness and give us a like, a subscribe, or a share. Pass it on to your friends. We do this primarily for the people of our church, but there are listeners out there that aren't here at our church anymore, and that's great too. And we're glad that this can be a blessing to you. Hopefully it helps you not just to know the Bible better for knowledge's sake, but to do what the name of the podcast is, which is to be more conformed to the image of Christ. That's the goal. So come back next week. We'll be back in Romans. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.